What's up, guys? I'm Josh. We're taking a look at the Moondrop Blessing 3 today. I have heard a lot about the Moondrop Blessing series of headphones, but I've never actually heard or reviewed them, surprisingly. I've reviewed quite a few Moondrop IEMs and I've heard even more, but for whatever reason, the Blessing just has kind of skipped by me. So the point of view that I'm going to carry for this review is a new person looking into this line of headphones. Is it good? Is it bad? What does it feel like to enter the Blessing family of headphones? Opus Audio Store sent this out. Moondrop has nothing to do with this review, and of course, no one is paying or asking me to say anything good or bad. All thoughts and opinions are my own. Now, this is a $320 IEM. Now, IEMs these days under even $200 are getting absolutely fantastic. They're even really fantastic under $100, honestly. They're very, very good. Even in Moondrop's own lineup, they have headphones like the Aria and the Chew that are extreme values for what they offer and sound flippin' fantastic. Now, the first thing that you might experience as a new consumer going into this is the unboxing experience. And I will say it is a little bit of a letdown. It's kind of this cheap paper box that doesn't really feel too premium. It comes with pretty standard stuff like a carry case and some extra silicone tips that are kind of just held in a plastic bag. The actual tips themselves do have a pretty cool appearance. They seem to have an upgrade on the faceplate, going from kind of a relatively cheap looking brushed plate to a really nicely polished kind of geometric plate. It's kind of sick looking, actually. The rest of the build here is actually quite sizable, but it feels really good. The way that they designed this thing around the concha is actually fairly decent, though the one thing that I think will be a problem for some users and is unavoidable here is that the ear stem is actually fairly large in diameter. Not the largest out there, but if you have problems with the ear stems, this one is certainly not small. It's also a triple nozzle design going into its various drivers. So this uses two dynamic drivers for the bass response. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. And then I think 4 balanced armature drivers for the mid-range and the treble response. Now, this headphone utilizes something called a horizontally opposed dynamic driver system for its dynamic drivers for its bass response. And that basically means that these are shooting like this. Now, this is nothing new to IEMs or the audio industry, but typically this means that the bass response is going to be really excellent. There are some really awesome subwoofers that utilize this technology and they sound phenomenal. Now, as a new user looking into this, I'm reading the website. I'm like, okay, like what should I be looking for when I'm purchasing this? And one of the things that they're talking about here is how good the bass response is because of this horizontally opposed dynamic driver system that they have. And they're talking about its capability here. And this is where I personally really wish that I could have heard the Blessing 1 and the Blessing 2, because the bass response on here is not good. For $300, it's really, really kind of stale, pretty flat. I can't get this thing to open up and sound really dynamic, and that has been perhaps the biggest disappointment of this headphone. Now, the real problem with the bass response here is the dynamics. It's how hard it slams. It doesn't really have a substantial amount of slam to it. You can get low and hard and some really, really hard-hitting music. Still doesn't have a lot of slam to it. So this is slightly disappointing in terms of the performance that I was expecting based off of its own kind of advertisement page. It wasn't talking about how natural the sound was. It was talking about how well these drivers functioned. So that was kind of disappointing to view this from a new customer standpoint of feeling like I didn't get something that I was supposed to get. Now, I know what you're saying. You're saying, okay, well, you need to change tips because the tips that this comes with are just standard silicone tips. They're really not that nice as far as $300 IEMs go. And I did change tips, but it felt like I was always compromising something to gain something else. It never felt like a win-win-win scenario. It always felt like, okay, let's increase the bass response by going with either foam tips or really nice silicone tips that enhance bass like the Final Audio tips. Okay, well, then you're going to compromise in other areas like the treble response is going to be completely dead, or the sound staging is going to be severely weakened, or the mid-range is going to have a weird timbre adjustment to it. And so despite having a ton of tips to kind of compare against, I really couldn't find anything that felt like a real victory for this headphone, despite what I've been able to find for other Moondrop headphones. And I really couldn't get this thing to sound substantial and significant in the bass response, and actually felt pretty dry, which sucks. Now, a lack of bass isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world. Some of my favorite headphones, like the HT600, are not really bass monsters, and I don't mind a sound signature that doesn't have a super, super deep bass, even if that's kind of what they were sort of marketing with this dynamic driver system that they have going on here. So super deep bass is a good thing to have, but it's not really a huge requirement, and it doesn't make the headphone terrible if it's not good. Now, regarding the treble response is fairly interesting. It is very, very detailed. I don't know if it stands out as being significantly more detailed than other things in this price category. I would say that it's about what I would expect. I'd say it competes easily with $300 IEMs and sub $300 IEMs for detail retrieval, and full-size headphones for detail retrieval at this price range as well. So it's pretty good there. It's kind of funny to me because I feel like in so many areas, the more a Moondrop headphone costs, the worse it sounds for some reason. Like, I really like their lower end tuning target. It seems to be much more appealing to me personally and seems to have more upsides than this does. Now, if Moondrop is going for a naturalistic tuning here, if they're going for something that feels very, I guess, lifelike in a way, where you don't really have the extremes of treble response, you don't have the extremes of bass response, I could kind of see how this headphone could sound good to somebody searching for that type of sound signature. But on a technical level, it feels less impressive than a lot of the competition, which kind of leaves a bad taste in my mouth given that the price tag is so significant for an IEM these days. It does seem a little bit forward and a little bit extra energy on some of the higher end vocalists. It actually comes across a little bit shouty sometimes, which is something that I feel like a lot of IEMs using this tuning style have figured out a while ago. But this one, for some reason, just hasn't. It's weird. Now, that slightly shouty mid-range, it does have a good center presentation. I wouldn't want to take away from its ability to really image really well. And one of the good things about this IEM, one of the truly great things that it actually does, is sound staging. It does feel very natural and very wide. I wouldn't say it's the most pinpoint IEM I've ever heard, certainly not. Definitely out-competed by a lot of other more expensive IEMs. But as far as $300 IEMs go or $200 IEMs go, this is about as good as I've seen it be, which is impressive to see. Now, I think that if this had really good and sizable bass response to it, that actually could have enhanced the sound staging to be even better than a lot of its competition, but it didn't. And I think that's one of the downsides to not having a substantial bass to it. So the pros and cons we have so far: pretty good sound staging, pretty good build quality is one of the better things. The accessories package is a little weak, but definitely not terrible. The comfort is really good. And on its own, this isn't a bad sounding headphone, actually. It has a fairly complete mid-range with a decent amount of body and fullness to it. Excellent positioning, like we talked about. The treble response has a very fast feeling to it. When you're listening to cymbals or really like decaying parts of an instrument, you can really pick all that stuff up. The problem with this IEM is that so many other IEMs can do that for cheaper nowadays. And that's kind of the biggest issue with this IEM. It standalone sounds fine. I would totally listen to this thing. But when you know what else exists out there, that's the real issue, is that there are other IEMs for cheaper that are better. So my recommendation here: look at the Moondrop Aria, look at the Moondrop True if you really want to save some money. You could get this general sound signature, which again, I don't absolutely love, but you can get pretty close with something like the Moondrop Kato, which is like $100 cheaper than this. Though I would personally recommend something like the C Audio Midnight at $200 for a really excellent sound signature. I think that's going to overtake this a little bit as my kind of top recommendation for $200 to $300 for an IEM. All right, I think that's going to wrap it up. Thank you very much for watching. See you guys in the next video.